Sunday dinners at my parents' place were nothing if not predictable. Mom's pot roast anchored the table, Dad picked the wine with practiced authority, and my brother Jason turned every gathering into a highlight reel of his professional life. This particular evening, he arrived waving his promotion letter like a winning lottery ticket, announcing that the company was elevating him to Senior Director of Marketing, complete with a 20% raise, a windowed office, and a car allowance. Mom pressed her palms together in delight and immediately asked about the numbers. 80,000 base, Jason told her, with bonuses that could push it close to 95. Dad lifted his glass in a toast, declaring that was exactly what happened when a man stayed the course and climbed properly. The unspoken addition hung in the air as it always did, unlike your sister, who's still wandering. I congratulated him sincerely. He had put in the work and earned it. He grinned back and suggested that maybe this would finally be the year I figured out what I wanted, the kind of comment he believed came across as brotherly teasing rather than quiet condescension. I was 31. He was 34. For a solid decade, this had been the pattern at every holiday and family meal. Jason's corporate climb applauded, my own path treated as an extended quarter-life crisis that simply hadn't resolved itself yet. I said I was doing fine. Mom immediately turned to Jason's wife Ashley and explained, as though I were furniture, that I was still doing that app development thing and that they kept hoping I'd eventually find something more stable. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I left it alone. Dad shifted into his familiar lecture about the dangers of freelancing: no security, no benefits, no retirement plan, no clear trajectory. I mentioned that I did have a retirement plan. He talked over it, recounting how at my age he had already logged a decade at the firm, building equity, cementing relationships, laying foundations. Jason leaned back in his chair, comfortable in his role as the family's success story, and offered to get me an interview in his marketing department. Entry level, he said, but it's a foot in the door. My phone buzzed again. Then again. Mom asked me to put it away. When I pulled it out to silence it, I caught a preview of a text that stopped me cold. Deal closed. Wire transfer confirmed. Call me. 3 missed calls from my lawyer. 2 from my financial advisor. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. Martin picked up before the second ring and offered his congratulations. The acquisition had finalized. TechCore Industries' payment had cleared. $80 million had landed in my account 15 minutes earlier. I pressed my back against the wall and let it settle over me. 6 years of building data stream analytics from scratch, from a one-person operation in my apartment to a company that TechCore couldn't afford to pass up. 6 years of 16-hour days, pitches that went nowhere, moments where bankruptcy felt like a foregone conclusion, and then finally, undeniably, explosive growth. Martin reminded me that the stock options would vest over 3 years, representing another potential $40 million depending on TechCore's performance. But the cash portion, the $80 million, was mine, free and clear. He told me I'd earned it. I thanked him for everything. He said he'd just handled the paperwork. I stood in that hallway for a moment, very still. From the dining room, I heard Jason's voice suggesting I was probably dealing with some client emergency, freelancer problems, he called it, with a little laugh. I walked back in and sat down. Mom asked if everything was all right, her voice carrying that particular shade of theatrical worry she reserved for me. I told her everything was fine. Good, she said, because Jason had been telling them about the BMW he was planning to buy with his raise, the 5 Series. He'd wanted one since college, and now he was finally at a point where it made sense. Ashley added that they were also booking the Italy trip they'd been postponing for years. Mom said warmly that they'd both worked. Dad nodded and told me that was precisely what stability produced: financial freedom, the ability to actually live. Jason leaned forward, his tone shifting into something he probably thought was caring. He noticed, he said, that I was always secretive about money, never willing to discuss what I made or where I stood financially. In his experience, that usually meant someone was struggling, but too proud to say so. I told him I wasn't struggling. He asked for a ballpark figure, suggesting that if I was genuinely doing okay, I had nothing to be embarrassed about. The table went quiet. Everyone waited. I could have let it pass. I could have changed the subject or given some vague, deflecting answer and let them go on believing what they'd always believed. But I was exhausted by years of being treated like the family's unsolved problem, exhausted by achievements that somehow registered as nothing because they didn't arrive packaged in corporate letterhead and a job title. I just sold my company, I said. Quietly, almost offhandedly. Mom asked if I meant my app thing. I told them the full name, Data Stream Analytics, a data aggregation and predictive analytics platform I'd been building for 6 years. TechCore Industries had acquired it. The deal had closed roughly 20 minutes ago. Jason's smile wavered. He asked how much they'd paid. $80 million, I said. Plus stock options vesting over 3 years, potentially worth another 40, depending on TechCore's stock performance. The silence that followed was total. Dad's wine glass stopped moving halfway to his mouth. Mom's fork struck her plate with a sharp clatter. Ashley's jaw dropped. Jason stared at me as though I'd switched languages mid-sentence. Mom whispered the number back to me. I confirmed it. Dad's voice came out sharp and disbelieving. He wanted to know if I was actually saying I'd just made $80 million. I explained that was the acquisition price for DataStream. My ownership stake had been 65%, so after taxes and legal fees my net would be around $48 million. The stock options could add another $25 million over the following years. And that was on top of the salary I'd been drawing for 4 years and some early investments that had performed well. All told, my net worth sat at roughly $65 million. The number landed on the table like something detonated. Jason's promotion letter, which he'd been brandishing triumphantly less than 20 minutes earlier, lay forgotten beside his plate. 80,000 looked very different from across a table where 80 million had just been announced. Jason said it wasn't possible, that I worked from my apartment. I told him I'd worked from my apartment for the first 2 years. For the past 4, we'd had office space in Manhattan. We currently employed 43 people across engineering, sales, and customer success. Mom looked as though she might faint. I continued. DataStream offered predictive analytics for supply chain optimization. Our client list included 17 Fortune 500 companies. The previous year's revenue had been $22 million. TechCore had pursued the acquisition because our technology integrated seamlessly with their enterprise platform. The pot roast sat untouched and cooling. Dad asked why I'd never told them. There was an edge in his voice, anger tangled up with confusion. I told him I had tried, more than once. But every time I brought up my work, it got filed away under app development or freelancing. Last Thanksgiving, I'd mentioned landing Walmart as a client and Jason had suggested I should try to get a job in their IT department instead of doing contract work for them. Jason flinched at that. At Easter, I'd raised our Series B funding round and Dad had told me to stop throwing around Silicon Valley buzzwords and focus on finding something real with benefits. Dad opened his mouth and closed it again. Just last month, when I'd tried to explain that we were in acquisition talks, Mom had asked if I'd considered going back for an MBA since my startup thing didn't seem to be working out. Mom's eyes filled. She said they hadn't known. I told her there was a difference between not knowing and not listening. Ashley found her voice and asked, carefully, if I was saying I was worth $50 million on paper. I clarified $48 million in liquid assets immediately, another potential 25 over 3 years, plus my salary history and early investments brought the total net worth to around $65 million. That number sat there like unexploded ordnance. Jason's face had gone pale. He said he didn't understand how it was even possible. I was younger than him. I hadn't even finished my MBA. I told him I'd dropped out of the MBA program because I'd been accepted into Y Combinator, a startup accelerator in Silicon Valley that had provided our first real funding and mentorship. DataStream was built during that program. Mom protested that I'd never mentioned Silicon Valley or startup accelerators. I reminded her that I had. She had thought I was wasting my time playing at being a tech entrepreneur instead of pursuing a real career. She had sent me job listings for administrative assistant positions. The subject line of that email, "Some opportunities for you," still stung. Dad said weakly that they had only been trying to help. I told him the difference between trying to help and trying to fix something you assumed was broken. I was never broken. I was building something. Jason pushed his plate aside and asked what came next. Was I just rich now, no more work? I explained that the acquisition included a 3-year consulting contract with TechCore. They wanted me to help integrate DataStream and potentially develop additional products. After that, I'd likely start another company. I told him I liked building things. "Of course you do," he muttered. I asked him what that meant. He said it was nothing, then immediately contradicted himself. He'd spent 12 years doing everything right, following the path Dad had mapped out, climbing rung by rung, and I had simply bypassed all of it and landed a fortune. I pushed back. I hadn't bypassed anything. I had worked 100-hour weeks for years. I'd maxed out credit cards to make payroll. I'd come within a hair of losing everything on 3 separate occasions. I'd just done it in a form that this family had never recognized as legitimate. He said that wasn't fair. I reminded him that not 10 minutes ago he had offered me an entry-level interview in his marketing department, genuinely believing he was doing me a favor, giving me a foot in the door. He'd had no idea what I'd actually built because he'd never once asked. Dad set his wine glass down with deliberate care and suggested we all take a breath. I told him I was perfectly calm. I was simply observing that this family had spent 6 years treating me like someone who hadn't figured it out yet, while I was in the middle of building a company worth tens of millions. Mom said they had never called me a failure. I told her she hadn't needed to say it. It was in every sympathetic glance, every nudge toward a stable job, every time Jason's milestones were celebrated while mine were treated as symptoms of aimlessness. The message had been unmistakable. Ashley offered, cautiously, that in fairness I had kept my work very private. I answered that I had shared plenty, major clients, funding rounds, new hires. But because none of it came wrapped in a corporate title and a benefits package, it hadn't registered as success. It had registered as someone still figuring things out. Mom tried to pivot the evening toward celebration, her voice bright and slightly forced. She said the news was wonderful and that they were so proud. I asked her whether she was proud or simply impressed by the dollar amount. The question settled uncomfortably over the table. Because I had been the same person for 6 years, doing the same work, achieving the same things. The only piece of new information in the past 20 minutes was the number. If the acquisition had come in at 800,000 instead of 80 million, would we be celebrating, or would someone still be suggesting I get a real job? No one answered. I said I was going to leave. I thanked Mom for dinner. I told Jason. And I meant it, that his promotion was a genuine accomplishment. He deserved recognition for it. Dad asked me not to go like this. I told him I wasn't leaving in anger, I just had a great deal to process, and this wasn't the right place to do it. I took my coat from the hallway. Jason caught up with me at the door. He was quiet for a moment, then said he was sorry. He admitted I was right, he hadn't taken my work seriously. He believed he was being helpful by dangling job opportunities, but looking back, it had been condescending. I told him he was right about that. He said that what I'd built was genuinely incredible, that he didn't fully grasp all of it, but understood enough to know it was something he could never have done. I thanked him. He asked if we were okay. I told him we would be, but that I needed him to understand something. This had never really been about the money. It had been about being seen, about having my choices respected, even when they looked nothing like what anyone expected of me. He nodded and said he was starting to get that. I drove home to my apartment, the one they'd all quietly read as evidence of financial strain, which was actually a rent-controlled place I'd kept because I loved the neighborhood and had zero interest in throwing money at expensive real estate while I was focused on building a company. My phone didn't stop. Messages from my team at DataStream, notes from former investors, a flood of LinkedIn notifications from tech publications eager to cover the acquisition, and one text from Mom. "We really are proud of you, sweetheart. I'm sorry we didn't show it sooner." I looked at that message for a long time. The thing about being underestimated is that it works on you like fuel. Every dismissive remark, every implication that you're squandering your time, every time someone else's more conventional success is held up as the standard, it all feeds the fire that keeps you moving. But once you arrive, once you've proven the doubters wrong, that fuel burns away and you're left facing a quieter question: what now? I had $48 million in my account. I had built something the market valued. I had the confidence of investors, of tech-core industries, of the industry at large. But the recognition I had wanted most, from the people at that dinner table, had only materialized once they heard the number. That night I didn't open champagne or book a reservation somewhere impressive. I ordered Thai food, settled onto my couch, and thought about what I wanted to build next. Because Jason had gotten one thing exactly right. I do like building things. Not for the money, though that's a reasonable thing to appreciate. Not even for the validation, though I'm human enough to want it. It's because there is something deeply and quietly satisfying about identifying a problem, conceiving a solution, and watching it become real. The following Sunday, I went back. Jason was different, more measured, asking actual questions about DataStream and genuinely listening to the answers. Dad seemed to be searching for a new way to relate to me, unsure of the footing. Mom kept proposing celebrations in increasingly elaborate forms. Things were changed. They looked at me differently, not because I had changed, but because they finally understood what I'd been doing all along. Over dessert, Dad asked what came next. I told him I had some ideas. The logistics industry had inefficiencies I thought I could address, and I'd been turning over the question of healthcare data integration. Jason asked if that meant another startup. I said maybe, or maybe I'd spend some time consulting, helping younger founders sidestep the mistakes I'd made. Whatever I decided, Dad said carefully, he would like to understand it. Really understand it this time, not dismiss it before it had a chance. I told him I'd like that too. It wasn't a tidy resolution. Years of being looked past don't dissolve in a single conversation. But it was a beginning.